As a minder of ghosts here in the infinite inning, one among our staff of spectral keepers, here's a little thing that has always bugged me a lot. Not even the dignity of the dead will stand in the way of what someone deems progress, or if they just want to make a few bucks. We pretend the dead have a lot of dignity. The president stands over their shipping containers as they are delivered back home, but then they go off to their final destinations and we forget. Bill Fowser, William C. Fowser, was one of the earliest baseball players, though not one of particular significance. I will tell you in advance, I know very little about Bill Fowser. He played 21 games for the original flavor Philadelphia Athletics in 1876, the first National League season ever. He was 20 years old, which means he was born before the Civil War in 1855. Now, you can go back further than that, further than Fowser with ball players, but not much farther. Baseball Reference, I love that they track this, says he was the 329th player in Major League history. In contrast, consider Connor Griffin, who this season with the Pirates arrived precisely 150 years after Fowser played. And isn't it weird that we're not making a bigger deal out of the 150th anniversary of Major League Baseball and the National League specifically? Griffin's serial number as a player is 23,639. So between him and Fowser stands Ty Cobb and Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and all the rest, Alvaro Espinosa even, and he shows up somewhere in the 23,000s versus 329. Fowser played some second base, the outfield, stood at first base about once, hit 135, that's 12 for 89, and he went home. That's it. That was his professional baseball career. Oh, and he made 21 errors in that time. This was barehanded baseball, so that's not at all surprising. Errors, in fact, are mostly how one locates him in game stories from back 150 years ago. The Hartfords win an easy victory from the Athletics, score 8-2. I read that as if it were on the radio, but of course radio was decades away, so you'd have to imagine it through a megaphone, and perhaps they're talking like this, yowza, yowza. Actually, yowza, that's the 20s, so I'm just lost. The Hartfords, in their half of the inning, scored 3 runs without a base hit. Burdick going to first on called balls, Remso on an error by Sutton, and Ferguson on Fowser's error. Subsequently, errors by Fowser and Ritterson enabled the scoring of the runs. Now, I'm not completely sure what Fowser got up to for the remainder of his life. I'm pretty sure he kept playing around the Philadelphia area in a league made up of railroad workers. He was, and I quote, a parlor car conductor and at other times a baggage master. One story notes that in one of his games, and he was pitching, coaching consisted of phrases like, "Stop at that station, put more sand on the track, and down brakes." When the excited runners would slide past a base, the mob would yell, "Down brakes!" Try that yourself the next time you're at the game. Down brakes! It sounds like it should have been part of an old railroad song, and for all I know, it actually was. If I'm looking at the right guy, he was married to a woman named Ella Kite, but he lost her in 1896 when she was only 34. Life was like that then and often still is, whereas I would normally use census records to prove that they were living together. As of 1880, Bill was still living with his folks, and by 1900 she was gone, and this is so frustrating. This has come up before. The 1890 census records were lost in a fire. The federal government had one copy, and they somehow set it on fire. I may be misleading you here, but I believe with some certainty that Fowser met his end in 1919. Well, wait, I didn't say that correctly. I know that he met his end in 1919 when he was 63. It's the manner in which he met his end that I'm not completely positive about. On April 30th, he was standing on the platform of the Huntington Street station of the Philadelphia and Reading Railway when he just dropped dead. Might have been a heart thing. Again, I could be wrong about a good deal of this. There's another Bill Fowser of the same age in Philadelphia at that time who is listed as a brickmaker who may or may not have been William T. Fowser, not our Fowser, who is William C. The railroad Fowser might have been 2 years younger than the baseball Fowser. In 1880, the baseball Fowser, and I'm sure of this one because I got it in one of those censuses that wasn't a victim of arson. He's listed as clerk in store. This is all very confusing, but for what it's worth, the Baseball Necrology, a book I often consult for this sort of thing, backs my reading of Fowser's death, saying he was a baggage man for 38 years, it's a living, and that he died while waiting for a train. I think the ambiguity adds to the story because you would expect it if I said, hey, we only know so much about the kingdom of Pontus on the shores of the Black Sea back in 200 BCE. But were I to say, and similarly, we really don't know that much for sure about this dude who played second base in Philadelphia 150 years ago, not 2,000 years ago, 150 years ago, in as recognizable a place as Philadelphia. A lot of the same buildings are still there. You might say, really? That said, there are some key buildings that aren't there as well, and that is in fact why I'm telling you this story. What I do know for sure is that when Bill Fowser's life had run its course, he was interred in Philadelphia's Monument Cemetery. It was a 15-acre property at Broad Street and Burke Street in North Philadelphia, opened up in 1837 under the name Père Lachaise Cemetery. That was in imitation of one of the most, if not the most, famous cemeteries in Paris. More about Paris in a moment. This is the one that houses many famous writers and some lesser ones, like Jim Morrison of The Doors, not terribly far from where Bill Fowser eventually lived. Ultimately, about 30,000 people were buried there, so a great day for the Rays in terms of attendance. It was closed to new burials circa 1929. They just ran out of room. Within just a few years, people had stopped caring about the place. The grounds were overgrown. Many headstones were vandalized. It was overrun by stray cats and rats. And so you'd think they wouldn't coexist nicely, but maybe 15 acres gave them room to do that. There was a lot of crime, both inside and outside the premises. And while, as of 1941, the caretaker, one William McDonnell, was quoted as blaming the weed-grown condition of many of the plots on the fact that the lot owners have not maintained their annual payments of the lots, with him saying, I think the younger generation has ceased to care about how the plots of their grandparents look, and they just don't bother about them. It wasn't that. It was that the cemetery got into a well-known cycle of failure that goes something like this. They start taking in fewer new, I guess customers would be the word, although the customers aren't really aware of it. It's the families who are the customers, which means they can't afford to invest in upkeep anymore. Simultaneously, the family members age out and become residents themselves, so they're not paying the dues because they're not there anymore. They're not alive anymore themselves. And maybe the subsequent generation, particularly if you started in Philadelphia in 1830, ended up out west in Illinois or Utah or California, and they just lose track of those things. By the 1940s, nearby Temple University coveted the cemetery grounds, which faced condemnation due to the lack of care. There were others eyeing the property as well, but ultimately, Temple got 11.5 acres of the 15 for $700,000, the rest going to the City Board of Ed for, I think, a playground. Temple planned to turn the cemetery into a field for sports, things like field hockey, and a parking lot, which is indeed what they eventually did. Now, they had to get the bodies out first. Nice of them to think about that. A lot of horror movies start with the premise that this step was skipped entirely during construction, leading to the soccer field of the damned. I want to note, by the way, there were many veterans in that cemetery, medal winners from the Civil War. Ceremonies on Memorial Day were held there annually. Didn't matter. Some desultory effort was made to contact known relatives of the deceased, but We're talking about bodies that were in some cases well over 100 years old, and like I said, people tend to move on. Only about 300 of them were claimed and reburied. So what do you do with a lot of dead people whose land you covet? If they were alive, the American way is you might kill them, but in this case, that would have been purely redundant. These bodies were functionally orphaned too, so there was no one to take their part. And, of course, they couldn't take their own part because the signature trait of being dead is that one lacks agency. And so, the new owners had them transferred, by which, again, I mean dumped, to Lawnview Cemetery near Rockledge, Pennsylvania, and they were placed in a mass grave, 28,000 of them. Again, not a bad day for, say, the Marlins in terms of ticket sales. I'm just trying to give you a tool, as usual, by which to visualize just how many former people that we're talking about. And I'm not done with the macabre stuff. The former residents of Monument Cemetery were gone, but their grave markers largely remained behind. So here's another question, a similar one. What do you do with thousands of heavy marble or stone blocks that have been separated from the bodies that lay under them? Well, you dump those too. A little later on, the Betsy Ross Bridge, one of several that crosses the Delaware River between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, was under construction. Here's a word I learned just for this story. Riprap, which just means rocks or other hard rubble you place along the shoreline to deter erosion. The builders, for some reason, took the abandoned stones from Monument Cemetery and tossed them down around the feet of the bridge to anchor the thing. Most seem to be underwater and have probably been eroded away to a large extent, but for whatever reason, the excess, I guess, ended up on the shoreline, mostly out of the water or out of the water at low tide. There are pictures and videos of this strange repurposing all over the internet. You can read names and birth and death dates on some of them. One that shows up a lot because it's big and landed upright is Mary Ann Lehman, 1829 to 1894. I'm so sorry, Mary Ann. They even did this with a 70-foot tall obelisk from the cemetery dedicated to George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, I don't know if Mary Ann Lehman's remains were claimed, Mom, Grandma, or she went into the hole with the other 27,999 bodies. I don't know which was the fate of Philadelphia Athletics' original flavor, Philadelphia Athletics, second baseman Bill Fowser's body either. If you read about the development of religion in human societies, you'll find a lot about ancestor worship. Before there were organized religions with hierarchies and bureaucracies and people wearing funny hats and scrolls or books telling you what the rules were, people had household gods, your personal protector. I'm not sure that what we have now is an improvement because I'm not sure people would want to kill each other over whether their personal savior was better than the other fellas, given that there would have been billions of them, one for every person. Ancestor worship was an early form of that too. You keep great-grandpa's skull above the hearth and you say, Grandpa Hunka, please intervene for me on this tiff I'm having with Beowulf, Thag, whatever. And like all invisible beings to whom we pray, sometimes it worked out and sometimes it didn't, which is the flaw in the whole thing. What if Thag was praying to his great-grandpa's skull, and they're both equally powerful on the spirit level? Penalties offset, replay third down? I don't know. I've never known how that's supposed to work. I'm sure you're familiar with the catacombs of Paris. In the 18th century, Paris had a lot of neglected cemeteries, just not the one that we talked about earlier, Père Lachaise, going back more than 1,000 years, and needed to do something about them because bodies were spilling into the basements of neighboring buildings. They had some of the same problems that Monument Cemetery later had too. Simultaneously, they had old mining tunnels going back as far as the Roman days, so they started pulling bones out of the dilapidated cemeteries, 6 million humans worth of them, and dumped them in the tunnels. In the early 19th century, someone had the ghoulish idea to take a small section of the catacombs and turn them into a kind of artwork, stacking the skulls and femurs and so on in eye-catching ways. It's still there. You can visit it. It happens to be under renovation at this very moment, but it is one of the more famous tourist attractions in the city, which is kind of odd in a way. Hey, kids, you want to go to an ossuary? What's an ossuary, Dad? Well, Timmy, it's like a warehouse for unclaimed bits of skeleton. Cool. Can we? There were some pretty famous French men and women represented among those dislocated skeletons, but you couldn't tell who was who anymore, and they didn't really care, and no one from, say, 8th century Gaul or whatever they were calling France in the 8th century was going to pop up and complain, so sure, let's play with them. Why not? I can think of about 1,000 reasons, but no one asked me. The one thing I do know is that them bones ain't gonna walk around on Judgment Day if their resting places have been paved over for a car park and a Wawa. Sorry, Bill Fowler, them bones ain't gonna walk around no Field of Dreams for you. I'm sorry to say that everything but the back of the baseball card, that is, you, have been misplaced. Now hear the word of the infinite inning. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the show, Infinite Inning number 370 in an ongoing series. I can see the circle of life and the light and the way that it all began, but I cannot see Bill Fowler. Who am I? I, too, am a kind of conductor on this railway through the gray lands of the Infinite Inning. They call me, my friends call me, Stephen Goldman. What do my enemies call me? Nothing I would care to repeat, in polite company, and I really do hope that I have very few people in that category. And if I do, if I have transgressed against thee, then allow me to say, I beg your pardon. Surely I meant well, I just might have been very confused at the time. When are we not confused? Really, if we're honest about things. It's good to have humility about that because most of the time it's probably true. What I am not confused about is the purpose, our mission in being here, and that is, as ever, we are on a time travel trip to the past on a mission to better understand the present, the time machine being often, but not completely, not always, the game of baseball. For this week's show, I really thought about having one story that was not at all baseball, that I couldn't even pretend had the most tenuous connection to it. And you know, I've done that every once in a while, and I didn't. I may yet do it next week, but there are times that I really want to talk more about current events and still stick to the time machine thing. Still take you on a trip, give you a story from the past that you might or might not know. And every once in a while, I don't have one that has bats and balls in it, but it seems very compelling to me. I put that off for a week. I might not put it off for 2. It would send us even further back than Bill Fowler, although he was alive when it took place, just not very old. And as you might expect, the reason that story occurred to me, and it's not even tangentially connected, really, it just seemed kind of like a mirror reflection of what we've been going through with the war in Iran, or the war with Iran, and the kind of unnecessary and immoral dread which we were all put through, never mind the Iranians who were threatened with extermination, but we who were, by virtue of being Americans, threatened with being a party to it, being in some sense responsible for it, and being put on the hook for the consequences, whatever they might have been. And what we saw was the bankruptcy, the intellectual bankruptcy of the approach that the administration took, because you keep ratcheting up the pressure and you say, well, I hit you, but you didn't do what I needed you to do, so I'm going to hit you again. And they still don't do what you want. And so you hit them again. And now you're frustrated and you say, okay, well, I'm not going to hit you. I'm going to stomp you into the ground. I'm going to, and this is a quote, bomb you back to the Stone Age. And whether that had worked or not in terms of getting the Iranians to come to the table, you've turned yourself into the big bad wolf from the Three Little Pigs, right? The part of it where the wolf nearly blows himself into having a stroke trying to knock down the house of brick. He's the insane aggressor at that point. And whereas his goal is, well, just to have dinner, he doesn't care if the pigs die, right? He doesn't care if he has to pick them out from under the bricks. But as the head of a government, In theory, what you're trying to do is advance some sort of policy that gets you somewhere that you want to go, that you want your country to go as a nation. And it's very hard to argue, I think, in any era, that any national policy that has to be brought about via a war of extermination is a just one. And putting that aside, very little has ever been achieved by bombing, and we tried this in Vietnam and it didn't work. And I'll tell you something, I learned something that I needed to learn as part of all of this that's been going on for the last several weeks. Because I felt from the outset that the bombing was immoral, and that even more bombing would have been more immoral and would have caused more unneeded death and suffering to no end that couldn't be achieved via negotiation. Now, I will say this much, that if you go around chanting death to America for nearly 50 years, you do run the risk that eventually you're going to get some people who take you seriously and don't think that you're just using that to create national cohesion around your government, which is what we do. We just do it with immigrants. We say, oh, we've got to rally around together because the bad guys are at the gate. Well, they say death to America. And you really can't take for granted that if they get nuclear weapons, that they didn't mean it. Simultaneously, you have to hope that they're rational actors, just like everyone else who's gotten nuclear weapons, which is to say that if you hit first, you're going to get hit back. And, well, it's the end of the world as we know it. That's how mutually assured destruction works and why those weapons can never be used. That said, my understanding is that all the intelligence was saying they were not close to acquiring a nuclear weapon, and that they were open to more negotiation to further push that point into the future. And so bombing, you're on the other side of Pearl Harbor now. When the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, the deliberations of the Kennedy government, RFK, the original, the one who was at least somewhat more reasonable than his kid, was given the suggestion by, among others, Curtis LeMay, the original bomb 'em back to the Stone Age guy, General Jack D. Ripper. Screw this, let's just go bomb the hell out of Cuba. Let's attack Cuba. And RFK said, my brother is not going to do any Pearl Harbors. And so it was kind of touch and go for a while, but we talked our way out of that one. Bombing is random. Bombing is indiscriminate. Bombing is not a great tool of policy. It's arson. It's like just burning somebody's house down to get their attention. And largely the history of these things is it doesn't work. And this is the thing that I learned, though, as someone who has been emotionally very affected by the Second World War, because the Second World War brings about both my parents and brings about, therefore, me, and brings me about in the context of a family that has been vastly reduced to almost nothing on both sides by the Holocaust. And that has affected the lives of most people around when I was young in one way or another. I have always felt a great anger, a great revulsion, a great regret, any negative word you can think of towards the Nazis and the Holocaust. And what other feeling towards it can you have, really, if you're at all human? And therefore, when I read the history of the war, or talked to people about it, and talked to people who were there, because again, when I was young, there were still a ton of people in that category, and I looked at Dresden, which the Americans and the British bombed in February 1945 and created a firestorm and killed thousands of people, including, by the way, American POWs. Same thing happened in Japan when we dropped the atomic bombs. I said, good. And people would say, no, that was a war crime on our part. That was an atrocity. And I'd say, no, damn Nazis, they got what they deserved. But you know what? There were women and children there too. And yeah, some of those women, some of those children supported the regime, and a lot of people around them had no scruples about killing women and children who happened to fall victim to the Nazis, happened to fall victim to the SS and wind up in the concentration camps. They weren't delicate about it, and they denied knowledge later. I don't believe that. But I also don't believe in collective guilt. I also don't believe that bombing did anything to hasten the end of the war. There were ways we could have done that had we cared to. We didn't, so this was purely punitive. And it seems to me that if I'm repulsed by the idea of doing something like that to Iran, and I'm repulsed that we did it to Hanoi in the 1970s, not a fan of either regime, definitely not a fan of Nazi Germany, but just because they were wrong about lots of things, as wrong as you can get, doesn't mean that our committing atrocities just sort of on a tit-for-tat basis makes us right. And so I find myself after many, many years having to swallow my sort of childish, serves you right. You can dish it out, but you can't take it. And no, I have to just say, yeah, that bit was wrong. You know what's not wrong? Max Muncy hit 3 home runs tonight. That's pretty cool. Walk-off shot after Edwin Diaz blew a save. Gotta hold to the good things and the bad things. Gotta count games as Joe DiMaggio ups his hitting streak day by day because it pushes the future away. As long as he keeps hitting, war will never come. And it happens by coincidence that Joltin' Joe is part of the story in the second act of the show, and sort of a lighter one. Let me say one other thing, by the way. I said a few minutes ago when we were talking in the first segment of the show that there are 1,000 reasons not to make art displays with dead people. Well, I'll give you just one, really. There really is just one, and it's simply this. You shouldn't disabuse people of the notion that some things are sacred, because they don't do well when they don't cherish things. If they think everything is fungible and disposable, then they treat them in that same way. Now, you can go too far in the other direction as well. In early Christianity, there was a subset of people in and around Rome and Byzantium who went kind of crazy digging up dead holy people. I got a magic finger. I got St. Sebastian's holy big toe. That had to be curtailed too because, the roads were getting to be filled with potholes. Anything that dehumanizes people, even long departed people, I think is a step in the wrong direction. Here's a step towards self-promotion. At Baseball Prospectus this week, I noted the passing of, I guess at this point, fairly obscure pitcher Ken Clay, who was with the Yankees and the Mariners and the Rangers for a bit. In the mid to late 70s, he was part of the 1977 and 78 championship teams for the Yankees, but not in a big way because the Yankees could never get him to achieve anything like consistency. And it's possible that he just didn't have the physical, the baseball tools to do that. But rather than accept that and move on, what they allowed themselves to do, and the owner in particular allowed himself to do, was to get very, very angry and frustrated. And that was going to lead to a counterproductive result, no matter what kind of tools Clay had. And I wanted to talk about that again in the context, and I never mentioned anything else. I never got outside of it, the baseball aspect of it. But I wanted to talk about that in terms of critical thinking and what is it that you are trying to accomplish for yourself, for your baseball team with the player, and how are you going to go about getting out of him what you need to get? Well, is publicly ripping him going to do that for you? It's not totally dissimilar to the whole bombing thing when you think about it. Very briefly, because we're vastly, vastly overdue for a break. There's a bit in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig about stuckness, and he talks about, as an example, needing to get the cover off of your motorcycle's engine, but it's jammed in place. You try a number of different techniques to loosen the thing, none of them work, and finally you get frustrated and you pound on it with a hammer. But what does that achieve besides denting your motorcycle? Not a thing. It is far better to walk away and ask yourself, what steps can I take that will achieve what I want or need to achieve, rather than having, another impotent tantrum. Speaking of which, the hosting program, which grades how often I put breaks in this thing, is going to have a tantrum of its own if we don't go to one now. On the other side, a notable outfield collision, or two. I make all kinds of notes for myself, both for use in this program and in my other work. And sometimes I end up using those notes and other times I toss them aside and I might forget why I wrote something down, even if I did end up using it. And just now during the break, I picked up one of these scraps of paper that I keep lying around on my desk. And I had at some point in the distant past, this piece of paper is kind of ancient. And maybe you remember my using this in a prior episode, but I wrote down a quote from Marcus Porcius Cato, known as Cato the Elder, who was a Roman senator from way back 234 BCE, and something that he said, which apparently impressed me in the recent past, was attempt only what you are able to perform, which I take to mean don't overreach, plan carefully, and do what you know you can do, and know what it is that you're trying to do. You can't formulate an intelligent plan if you don't know where it is you're trying to go. And that thought seems very consistent with everything we just talked about in the last portion of the program. I felt so harried by the need to take a break that I forgot to mention that I did get Dead Player of the Day going after a week off. I only did 3 this week because I was pressed. Those 3: Cardinals catcher from a long time ago, Vern Clemens. As I said, they've had a lot of great catchers. He's not necessarily one of them, but you could also do a lot worse. There was Leroy Stanton, an outfielder in DH who was snake-bit in a lot of different ways, but broke out just in time to be part of the Mariners' inaugural season in a large way. And lastly, 1920s Brooklyn Dodger Jimmy Johnston, who was kind of an everyday sub and someone I've always been a little curious about. He was something like a 25 or 30 WAR player for his career, but I'll tell you, players like him who were just good enough that they prevented the team from having to play the really bad player, the replacement level player that they would have had to go to had he not been around, had he not been as versatile. Those players are worth their weight in gold. I do believe I made that one free, open to everyone, whether you're a Patreon member or not, so please head on over and read away. I write them to be read. So let's finally turn to Jolt and Joe. A day and a half ago or so, as I speak these words, so April 9th, there was a frightening collision between Detroit Tigers outfielders in their 3-1 loss to the Twins. Center fielder Parker Meadows and left fielder Riley Green were both going for a ball popped into the gap. Green had it lined up, but Meadows was charging. He was appropriately watching the ball instead of his teammate. I don't know if Green called for it, and he crashed right into Green. Meadows got the worst of it. His head took a hard blow. He bit something, his cheek or his tongue or his lip, and for a moment before the camera tastefully cut away, you could see blood draining from the left corner of his mouth. He was eventually able to get up, but he looked pretty out of it. He was taken off the field upright on a cart. He was held in the hospital overnight, and as of Friday, the word was that he needed 5 stitches to close that wound in his mouth, which in itself is not great, but unfortunately, that's not the whole bill. He was also concussed, and he fractured the radius bone in his left arm. If you watch the play, and I'm not saying you should, although there have been more graphic and grotesque sports injuries, his left arm hits Green, and he's spun very hard from the impact and is thrown down very hard on that same arm, so it's your guess as to which of the impacts broke it, and I suppose it doesn't matter. It's a fortunate thing for baseball that plays like that don't happen too often, because if they did, the outfielders would have to be armored up like football players, and everything hit in the gap would be a triple, sprint speed being greatly hampered by all that extra weight. And it would be reasonable, too, because those collisions can lead to season-ending injuries. You might remember, and this is just one example of many, but it's a fairly recent one anyway, the day in April 1992 that Ozzie Guillen and Tim Raines, shortstop and left fielder respectively, collided chasing Mel Hall's pop-up. This was at Yankee Stadium. Raines was more or less okay, as I recall, but Guillen's knee was destroyed, and he was out for that season after just 12 games. He played for a long time after that, but that marked the end of him as both a base stealer and a Gold Glove level fielder, and since he was a very impatient hitter, that didn't leave a whole lot, except for character, and of course that's what he's known for, and one of the reasons why the White Sox are about to retire his number. Sometimes those injuries can change pennant races. In 1957, the Braves, the Milwaukee version, opened the season with an outfield of Bobby Thompson in left field, Bill Bruton in center, and Henry Aaron in right. In early July, Bruton and second baseman Felix Mantilla collided head-on, chasing a pop-up hit by Bill Verdon of the Pirates. Mantilla missed about 3 weeks. Bruton had a tooth knocked out, required 8 stitches to his lip, and most significantly required knee surgery. He wasn't able to play again until May of the following year. Bruton's whole deal was speed and defense plus something like a league average bat, so a knee injury was a real threat to him and a real loss to the Braves. They made up for it extremely well, though, in that what general manager John Quinn and manager Fred Haney did was to move Aaron to center, and at 23 he was up to that challenge. Then they traded out Thompson to get Red Schoendienst, thereby solving an unrelated problem at second base. That, in turn, pushed Mantilla to shortstop, which allowed them to replace a slumping Johnny Logan for a while, although he turned out to have a pretty decent year. Losing Thompson made a regular out of Wes Covington, a 25-year-old who was a pretty miserable defensive outfielder, but hit .284 with a .339 on base percentage and a .537 slugging percentage in 96 games, which was not an unrealistic depiction of his abilities. They then patched the hole opened in right field by moving Aaron with the veteran Andy Pafko, who we happened to talk about last week, and even catcher Del Crandall on occasion, until late in the season, and these are all stories to some extent that we've told on the show, they called up a journeyman outfielder named Bob Hurricane Hazel, who had one of the great stretch runs of all time. In 41 games, he hit .403, .477, .649, thus did the Braves overhaul the Cardinals, win the pennant, and then beat the Yankees in 7 in the World Series, in whole or in part, simply because Mantilla and Bruton had that horrible collision. I'm not saying it was a good thing, it just happened to set off a bunch of beneficial changes. As that collision suggests, if you patted the outfielders, you'd have to get the shortstop and the second baseman as well, because a lot of these in-between plays aren't between outfielders, but on looping hits that are just past the infield. Derek Jeter was justly maligned for his lack of lateral range, but he was great going back on those sorts of balls, and mostly he caught them. I'm sure, though, on those plays, a lot of the left fielders and center fielders, especially the younger ones as time went on, were saying to themselves, don't run over Derek Jeter. Don't run over Derek Jeter. You crush someone popularly regarded as being akin to a demigod, that's not going to do great things for your own popularity. If you do it at home, you might require a police escort to get out of the building. That same sort of thinking was partially why Mickey Mantle pulled up short in, Game 2 of the 1951 World Series on a ball hit between him and Joe DiMaggio. DiMaggio, as always, was playing center. Mickey was playing right. He caught his foot on a drain cover, and he had his ACL wrenched in two, essentially. He didn't want to be the teenager from Nowheresville, Oklahoma, who put the Yankee Clipper in traction. The funny thing is that a different rookie had nearly done it himself just 13 years earlier. It wasn't the Mick's fault. He was only 6 at the time. An even greater irony is that DiMaggio was so unpopular at that moment that folks might have cheered if he'd gotten severely hurt. I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. On April 30th, 1938, Joe was 23 and just getting started on his season, even though the campaign had begun 2 weeks earlier. This was the spring of DiMaggio's big holdout, the one in which the Yankees' then owner, Jacob Ruppert, blasted him as being ungrateful and selfish, and then, once he signed, made him pay his own way to spring training and docked him until he was ready to rejoin the team. I know I've given you what he said before, but I can't resist an encore on something as tone-deaf as a rich guy blasting a great player like this. DiMaggio is an ungrateful young man and very unfair to his teammates, to say the least. He wants $40,000 and I've offered $25,000 and he won't get a button over that amount. Why, how many young men earn that much? As far as I'm concerned, that's all he's worth to the ball club, and if he doesn't sign, we'll win the pennant without him. DiMaggio had just hit .346 with a league-leading 46 home runs, despite being a right-handed hitter in old Yankee Stadium. He hit 19 at home, 27 on the road. And look, Jake, you don't win pennants when you lose your 8-WAR center fielder, I'm sorry to say. And in fact, the Yankees were 6-6 without DiMaggio. I know it's a small sample, but it's a pretty good hint. And Ruppert should have known. He didn't win the pennant the year Babe Ruth got sick either. DiMaggio's season debut came in Game 13 at Washington. So many of my Yankees stories take place at Griffith Stadium for some reason. I feel like many of my stories in general take place at Griffith Stadium, or a disproportionate amount, and whenever they come up, or the Browns, I find myself asking, would the audience find this more relatable if it weren't about a team that is extinct? I don't know. I'm also the sort of person who likes to look back at Disneyland and read about the defunct rides and say, oh, that would have been cool to go on, or that one sounds lame. Well, I feel like Washington Senators, St. Louis Browns, and so on are kind of like former rides at a theme park. And on that note, I still miss 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea at Disney World. It's a really good movie, and it was a fun ride. I also wish Adventure Through Inner Space, presented by Monsanto, had lasted long enough for me to go on it with my PhD chemist wife. I enjoy doing science things with my science spouse, and unfortunately, I could never do that one. It went away from Disneyland as of 1985. We didn't meet until many years after that, and it was replaced by Star Tours, which I have done several times, and I like Star Wars as much as the next guy. However, mostly it just makes me ill. There's not much science to discuss there unless it's the science of dizziness and nausea and inner ear disorders and things of that nature. What I'm trying to say is I like telling you stories about Griffith Stadium. So back to April 30th, DiMaggio making his season debut, batting third against the knuckleballer Dutch Leonard, Emil Leonard, a really good pitcher, career .325 ERA. Joe did not finish the game, nor did another future Hall of Famer in the Yankees lineup, second baseman Joe Flash Gordon, an all-time great at his position who wasn't inducted into the Hall until 31 years after his death. He was a fantastic glove who also hit up to 30 home runs a season as a Yankee, despite, again, being a right-handed hitter in old Yankee Stadium. You know the line from the Comden Green Bernstein song, New York, New York, New York, New York, it's a hell of a town, the Bronx is up and the Battery's down? Well, in the original Yankee Stadium, home plate and the left field wall were separated by about the same distance as the Bronx and the Battery, so about 13 miles. Gordon is one of many players from before our time I would love to have seen play. That combination of home run power and elite defense at second is pretty unusual. We're talking about players like Chase Utley, who is almost certainly going to get into the Hall himself in the next couple of years, and Marcus Semien, who probably needs a bounce-back season or two to get there. You might not think of Semien that way because he found his bat relatively late by baseball standards, but going back to 2019, he's had 3 seasons that, in the right year, might have won him an MVP award. He finished third all 3 times. And now I am going to finish my obligation to take breaks for this episode. So let us pause briefly. Let us head out to the lobby and buy some bonbons if we have a freezer case. I don't know that we do, but if we do, you should definitely do that. It's always fun to have something melting in your fingers when you're in a theater. It's a real challenge to get that done neatly. And then on the other side, I will tell you what actually happened in this game of April 30th, 1938. No more delays, no more preamble. And so, if you will just bear with me, I will see you on the other side. We've discovered that fish can talk. They tell you about timetables, but time circles is more the truth. In the 6th inning, Senators pinch hitter Taffy Wright, a very good hitter, he was a rookie, birth name Taft, popped a Spud Chandler pitch into the shallow outfield. The ball was tailing towards left, so both DiMaggio and Gordon were coming at it from an angle. Merrill Hogue, the left fielder, was also coming in, so it's a fortunate thing that there wasn't a 3-way collision. There was a play the other day. I think one of the Rockies hit this ball, but I might be remembering it incorrectly. It was bounding up the middle, headed straight to the second baseman, was going to be a routine 4-3 play. When it hit a corner of the second base bag, kicked into the air, and shot into the outfield, the batter had a single on a standard grounder, and I thought to myself, why does that happen so rarely? Why is it something that seems to happen only once in 10,000 batted balls? Or something of that nature. Well, we can be thankful that these kinds of bloop flies into the outfield that are positioned perfectly such that 2 or even 3 different players try to go for them don't happen all that often, but it's hard to say exactly why they don't. Gordon and DiMaggio plowed into each other at full speed, the second baseman running the right side of his chin into DiMaggio's left temple. Both dropped. Bouncing apart, they rolled on the turf as players poured from both benches, said Arthur Patterson in the New York Herald Tribune. DiMaggio lifted his head and looked around, but sank back again, while Gordon remained almost motionless. Somehow, Merrill Hogue had caught the ball at the same time he was avoiding his 2 teammates. As Patterson's description suggests, DiMaggio blacked out for just a second or two, but booted right back up again, while Gordon was unconscious for about 5 minutes. I believe they walked off the field rather than being carried off, but whereas Joe was then able subsequently to walk to an ambulance, Gordon had to be carried. Both had facial bruises and swelling, as well as bruising on other parts of their bodies where they contacted each other. Incredibly, fortunately, X-rays revealed no broken bones for either player. DiMaggio left the hospital the next morning, was in the lineup that afternoon, and hit his first home run of the season off of Elon Chief Hogsett. Gordon missed 5 weeks with soreness in the arm and shoulder, which had struck Jolton Joe. Gordon was a rookie. He had done exactly the thing that had caused Mickey Mantle to pull up and hurt himself in 1951, but the press blamed DiMaggio for the collision. If he had just signed his contract, they said, he and Gordon would have been more used to working together. Not that that explains away any of the dozens and dozens of other plays of this nature that have occurred throughout baseball history and indeed had taken place before that. In preparing this story, I sorted through the RetroSheet event files for the decade of the 1930s and found about 15 outfield collisions that I felt reasonably sure about, and a whole bunch more that I would need to do further research on to make sure that I had understood them correctly. None of those other players had just staged famous holdouts. Actually, there's an earlier collision between DiMaggio and Merrill Hogue, where Hogue played one more game and then was out for the rest of the season. They thought he was fine, hence he played that next game, but during it, he began to have convulsions and then would spontaneously lose consciousness. He had an undiagnosed blood clot pressing on his brain, and soon he was in the hospital fighting for his life. Now, you could have blamed DiMaggio for that one too, because Hogue was the veteran and DiMaggio was a rookie. So there's that lack of familiarity rearing its ugly head again, but we know that that wasn't the case. It's the very randomness of baseball that causes a play like the Green Meadows collision, and I know I just said Green Meadows, but that's their names, or DiMaggio Gordon to be unusual. It's still not enough, though, to defeat the narrative, whatever it is that the pundits think will sell. And then and now, they're oh so often against the player who tries to make more money for himself. In short, they got you, kid. They got you, just like they said they would. Again, Cato said, do only what you can accomplish. Well, that might go for trying to catch short flies as well. You can catch me on social media at stephengoldman.bsky.social. You can also write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And there's a Facebook group. Simply go to Facebook, search on Infinite Inning, and bang, you're there. Should you wish to support the show, and I very much hope you do, please visit patreon.com/theinfiniteinning. As I said, Dead Player of the Day is back, and I will keep rolling those out until we reach post 100, a little over halfway there. Gear of a rudimentary kind available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available gratis at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, really, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. It helps the show gain attention. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, I suppose you have no other recourse than to join the Sumela Monastery in the Pontic Mountains. Our theme song, which you are listening to now and have been hearing throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who says, if you've a date in the Kingdom of Pontus, they'll be waiting for you in Gumashana. Well, I think I need an atlas, and if I can find one, I'll find my way back here next week with more tales from inside the Infinite Inning.